I'd like to welcome everyone to the 14th Annual Pennsylvania Concrete Conference. In the construction industry, I think in a lot of other areas, we like to build on past accomplishments. And if we look at even this conference here, what we've always done is built on past history. We started our first conference back in 2000. And each of our conferences, we've kind of evolved, kind of made it a little different, and try to be as customer friendly and try to address the needs and concerns of folks in the industry. And being in the construction industry, I'm not a high-rise building construction person, but you know, when you go and build things up, you start on the foundation, you go to 1, 2, 3, 4. And for all of you that, a couple of you that brought to my attention, you know, last year we had the 12th concrete conference, and you know, a lot of high-rise buildings, there isn't a 13th floor. So, with respect to the Pennsylvania conference, there isn't a 13th conference either. So, anyway, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Chuck Niederreiter, who's the Chief Operating Officer for Golden Triangle Construction. His responsibilities include overall project management of field employees, estimating. He develops a lot of stuff for Golden Triangle. He's a Pitt graduate, got his BS in civil engineering from Pitt, and he is also the newly elected chairman of the ACPA Pennsylvania chapter. So with that, let's welcome Mr. Chuck Niederreiter.
Thank you. Good morning. My name, as John said, is Chuck Niederreiter, and I'm the newly elected chairman of ACPA Pennsylvania. On behalf of the chapter, as well as all of our collaborating organizations, including PennDOT, the FHWA, the Aggregate and Ready Mixed and Concrete Promotional Council, the Concrete Pipe folks, the pre-stressed concrete industry, ACI of Pittsburgh, and the consulting engineering community, welcome to the 14th Annual Pennsylvania Concrete Conference. This morning, ACPA had the opportunity to meet with Deputy Secretary Scott Christie, Bureau Directors Brian Thompson and Charlie Goodhart. We appreciated them taking the time to meet with us this morning and look forward to working with the department to enhance concrete pavement quality as the concrete pavement industry strives to see an increased use of concrete pavement in the Commonwealth. The ACPA Pennsylvania chapter has also been hard at work promoting the need for a long-term solution to the transportation infrastructure funding crisis. We had the opportunity to meet yesterday with individuals representing both the Pennsylvania House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats, to talk about transportation funding. Transportation is not a partisan issue, and to get transportation funding enacted will require both bipartisan and bicameral support, as well as, of course, the support from the governor. We hope to hear some good news from the Secretary in a few moments. The concrete paving industry stands ready to work to provide the road users with long-lasting, durable concrete pavements. In our efforts to raise the awareness of the need for a long-term solution to transportation funding, we often get asked if we have the capacity to handle a ramped-up program. Many of the concrete paving contractors in Pennsylvania are being aggressive in picking up work in West Virginia, Ohio, and elsewhere. We would love to be able to stay closer to home when picking up concrete paving work. And from the material side, we have the capacity. The Portland cement industry in Pennsylvania manufactures over 8 million tons of Portland cement. That's enough to build a 4-lane concrete road from Philadelphia to San Francisco each and every year. On the technology side, we want to take a moment to thank the department for joining the National Concrete Consortium in 2007. The National Concrete Consortium is managed by the National Concrete Pavement Technology Center, which is funded by investments made by the FHA, many state highway agencies, as well as industry groups such as ACPA Pennsylvania. I believe there's much to be shared with other states that use concrete, and also much to be learned from those states as well on mixes, pavement designs, joint layout, innovative testing, contract delivery systems, and more. On this theme, we want to highlight projects where new technologies have been used. We will hear at lunch about one project located in District 12. We also have 2 presentations on overlays at our conference today, one on the performance of concrete overlays on Interstate 80, and one on the District 8 project near Carlisle that was the result of the NCPTC open house that took place in 2009. Many northern tier states have used concrete overlays for many years and are enjoying excellent performance of these types of products. And we don't have to go far to see one example of this. We have a thin 2.5-inch thick concrete overlay that is located just down the road at the I-83 US 22 interchange that was built in 1995, over 16 years ago. I encourage you to visit with the vendors and exhibitors. They have much to offer in terms of new products and more. I also want to thank all of the sponsors for supporting the conference. Finally, we will hear about opportunities for implementing new technologies, sustainability, quality, upcoming projects, and recently completed projects. We hope that you take some of what you've learned here in the next few days back with you. Listen, learn, ask questions, but enjoy the conference. Is Gary here? You all recognize our first guest. Barry Schoch agreed to serve under Governor Corbett as Secretary of Transportation. The reason most of us recognize and know Barry is that he has spent a tremendous amount of time attending meetings and events such as this one, gathering support from across the state for the proper funding of our transportation systems. We are thankful to have such an advocate leading us into the future. Please join me in welcoming Barry Schoch.
Morning, everybody. You all awake here? It's pretty quiet. Good morning. First of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm really glad to see organizations like this to continue, and the employers who represent all of you today continue to support activities like this. One of the things as I talk about the need for investment in transportation that becomes a very real part of our struggle, if you will, to get more money, is the fact that we compete for taxpayer dollars. While we talk about the need for investment in our industry, and it's very real, it's very easy to talk within the closed walls of this type of a room and get consensus, unanimity. If I asked how many of you are willing to pay more for transportation, I'm sure every hand would go up. The issue is, out there in the public, in general, the public says we pay enough in taxes. If you want to spend more in transportation, just prioritize that and spend less somewhere else. So in essence, to some extent, we compete, and we have to show that in our industry, we're constantly moving the ball forward, constantly being more innovative, and constantly making best use of every dollar we get. I think organizations like this and the trade associations where you're constantly getting together to talk about best practices, talk about what's going elsewhere in the country, talk about advancing the ball and using new technologies, is something we all have to do. And we have to recognize that it's a part of competing for funding. Here in Pennsylvania, I'm proud to say that here at PennDOT, there's a lot of our representatives here today, we're partnering with the Federal Highway Administration and private industry to create a statewide transportation innovation council for that very reason. I think that although I know many of you know me from my years of consulting engineering, 28 years in this industry has led me to this position. Now that I'm in the position and spent a year in government and listened to the dialogue and debate about how to get more funding for transportation, it's clear that all these decisions overlap. If the governor is going to support more transportation investment and the legislature is going to support more transportation investment, as soon as they say they're going to, every other industry is going to be lining up saying, why not us? Why not more money for education? Why not more money for this program? Why not more money for this program? And I think it's important that we aggressively talk about how we're making best use of the dollar. And I think a lot of what you're going to do here at this conference, a lot of what we'll do on the State Transportation Innovation Council, talking about innovative ways to take the dollars we have and stretch them further, will only help us in that argument about how to get more money. Now, there's a lot of things I could talk to you about today, but what I'm going to try to do is be a little bit brief and tell you about what our initiatives are at PennDOT along those lines, and then where we are in the finance, because I'm sure that's of utmost interest. And while I don't have a huge amount of new information for you, what I try to do each time I come out is tell you what I know as of, 9:50 this morning, and then let you ask me some questions. I know we've got about a half hour time here. So rather than me just speak the entire time, I'll give you some remarks about what we're doing at the department and where I think we are on the funding side, and then give you a chance to ask some questions before I allow you to continue on with your conference. So let me just tell you a little bit about within the department. When I took this job and interviewed with Governor Corbett about the position, there were two things that I thought were absolutely items that needed to be addressed. And one of them is this overall finance, and I'll talk a bit more about that. The other is making the department a better employer. It's been over 4 years since our management staff has had an increase in salary. And along that time frame, letting alone the fact there hasn't been an increase in salary, and I know it's been difficult in many industries. In my prior firm, we laid off about 10% of the firm before I left because of declining business. So in many cases, private industry is letting people go. Within government, there's been a 4-year freeze on salaries. And I'm not so much looking to say, let's do a 5% raise or a 3% raise to try to start showing some movement. What I want to do is be able to attract and retain people so that we have qualified professionals continually at that agency to oversee the dollars that we do have. And right now, I would say, for a typical engineering position, we're about $20,000 behind where we should be in salary. That's a huge gap. It's a gap that isn't made up for in benefits. It's a gap that's not made up for in the promise of a pension if you stay for 30 or 35 years. It's a gap that's just too large, and it's growing every year. And ironically, if we're successful at getting more money in the program, what will happen on the private sector? It will create a demand for engineers and scientists and experienced professionals in the private sector, which, of course, leads you to an employer that has the market cornered on experienced, underpaid, disgruntled employees. Right here. So I want to make sure that we have a plan that addresses a need long-term to restructure our payroll structure in a way that we can attract and retain people. For me, it's always been something I've advocated that people should go back and forth from private to public sector. I think it benefits both sides because you bring the experience to the private sector to the government. If you're in government and go to private sector, you bring that experience to the private sector. So I'm pleased to have the opportunity to be in government and have an opportunity to work with the professionals at PennDOT to both work on policy initiatives that affect the industry and also work on long-term a plan to staff the agency and compensate people in a way that we're able to attract and retain good people. And I always ask for this when I'm talking to groups like this, and I say we need your help in working with the legislature when it comes time on finance. I also need your help while you're there to remind them that it's important that we compensate government officials and representatives appropriately. So while you're out there talking to legislators about the need for investment in transportation, please talk about the fact that we need to be able to compensate engineers and scientists and people that work at Department of Transportation comparable to the private sector. And for many folks, you might look at that and say that's the professional side. I can tell you right now we're having a heck of a time keeping CDL commercial driver license folks because of the Marcellus shale industry. And in that northern tier, where we were once an employer of choice and rarely lost individuals to anyone else, we're losing high turnover to the Marcellus shale industry. So it's all parts of our business, not just the professional part. So we're working at that, and we're going to continue to push for changes in that regard. Also, I mentioned the Statewide Transportation Innovation Council. Within the department, this is a philosophy, I guess, of mine that I think probably applies to every one of you that's in business. You're here today as an association, and yet you compete with each other. And in my prior life as a consulting engineer at McCormick Taylor, we were a part of ACEC. I was even the transportation chair for ACEC. There were things we did together as an organization at ACEC, just like you're doing here with Concrete Pavement Association. But then you go out of here and you go back to your own business, you compete with one another. And to compete with one another at your own business, you probably are constantly looking at what do you need to do differently to compete well. I know at McCormick Taylor we felt that way. We felt like if we just rested on our laurels, we'd get passed up. And we had to continually, even if we were successful, continually say, how do we change to evolve, to continue to be, whether you want to call it cutting edge, whether you want to call it new, innovative, whatever the terminology you want to use, how do you keep changing your business, moving it forward to make sure that you're competing well? And within the department, we're trying to do the same thing. Not that anyone's done anything wrong in the past, it's simply evolving and what we call modernizing the agency. As a matter of fact, if you read the Funding Commission report, you'll see a whole section focused on modernization, things that we think we can do to take advantage of technology. As simple as, even if you look at registration, we're trying to work with the state police and the legislature to change from a 1-year to a 2-year registration which reduces our costs and every one of your costs if you register a vehicle, and get rid of that sticker that you put on the license plate for inspection. With the computer software that the state police have, it's no longer as necessary to have that little sticker to indicate your car is registered. They can simply run your plate quickly with imaging and know whether or not you're registered. And if we can do that, get rid of a little sticker, it means you can do everything online. You never have to write a check to us. You can do it all online, do it once every 2 years. Reduces your cost, reduces our costs, allows us to, at some point, probably reduce staff, which reduces our long-term recurring cost of delivering the service. That's an example of using technology. Within the department, we have a tool called IdeaLink, which is a web-based tool that allows all of our employees to submit their ideas on how we can make the department, any part of the department, whatever they do, make a suggestion of things we could change to make it either more efficient, less costly, or simply deliver better service. And I was gratified that when that got launched, we had over 300 responses very quickly. And we've already implemented about 70 of them. And we're going to keep doing that. Keep pushing the envelope within the agency, getting ideas from our employees, soliciting and letting people know that we're interested in moving the agency forward. Again, not because it hasn't been done so in the past. Al Buehler did a tremendous job as Secretary. It's just simply recognizing where we are today. We have to keep pushing that envelope and then sharing that message. And just yesterday, I sent a report to the 4 transportation chairs and the leadership positions within both caucuses at the House and the Senate of our status of modernization, saying that we recognize that one of our jobs as stewards of public dollars is to push the envelope in reducing our costs to deliver projects, reducing time and costs. We're going to pilot a lot of things in the coming years that you'll be a part of. We're going to pilot new ideas. I know you're going to talk about innovative strategies here, things that you think might be innovations we should look into. We're going to try it, pilot it, examine it, and decide whether it should go statewide. That's the whole idea of the State Transportation Innovation Council, is to try new ideas, push the envelope, and then communicate it. I know Bob Latham's here somewhere, and APC has a research group, education foundation, looking at branding. How do we change the messaging around what we do as an industry and say we're making your lives better and we're doing so more efficiently? If we can get that message out, I think it enhances our ability to get more money. In your business, it's how do you enhance your business to create a better market for yourselves, for your company, create more billings, more revenue, more growth? Well, I think in our case, we have to look at it the same way. As an industry, how do we brand ourselves in a way that shows we're being efficient? How do we communicate that? How do we communicate the fact that the things we're doing improve quality of life, improve safety, and improve trip reliability? We're going to work hard at that within the department. We need the entire industry to recognize that that's an important part of what we're going to do and how we're going to achieve success and continually getting more money. Because again, we're competing. We're competing for taxpayer dollars. And we have to remember that. Just like you're competing with each other, we're competing with other industries out there who also would like to see more government funds directed towards them. So, with that, on the funding side, where are we? Well, not a whole lot has changed since probably the last time how many of you were at APC, heard me speak at APC? Quite a few. I always ask that just so I don't repeat myself too much. But where we are in funding is that the governor, again, has continually said there are 4 priorities for him for legislation during this legislative session, meaning the one that ends this November. Marcellus Shale, education, transportation, and privatization. Marcellus Shale, if you're following that, it looks like there's some movement on getting a negotiated settlement to that. Hopefully that'll occur. Education doesn't look as promising. Whether the governor continues to try to pursue that or not, I'm not sure. Transportation and privatization are the other 2. Not necessarily linked. You may read about the fact that people are suggesting they should be linked. I don't believe that. The governor has never said that to me, that he links the 2. Although he has told me that when he's in a room, a general room where he's talking to people in a room like this, he'll say, how many of you think we should privatize the state stores? And he said, most of the hands go up. And then he'll say, what do you think we should use the money for? And he'll throw out different topics. And he said, consistently, the response he gets the most support for is, if we privatize it, the money should go into transportation. Consistently around the state. Now, that doesn't mean he's saying we should privatize these liquor stores for the purpose of using the money for transportation. He philosophically believes we should not be in the business of selling liquor. But he has said that if we do it, that he at least wants a chunk of those proceeds to go towards transportation. My suggestion on that is that, if you believe the numbers, anywhere from $500 million to $1.5 billion is the amount of money they talk about raising. In our world, that's not a lot of money. It would be gone in a hurry. If $500 million came our way, I'm not sure anyone would notice what we accomplished. That's sad to say, but and that amount of money, but it's true for what we do. However, if you took that $500 million or whatever it might be, and you put it into our aging transit fleet and converted them to smaller, more efficient natural gas or electric, you would have a long-term reduction in recurring costs of the operating costs of the transit side of the business. That might be a better use if we're talking about transportation investment. Building the maintenance facilities for the large transit agencies so they could actually work on and accommodate natural gas vehicles. Right now, I've heard people criticize SEPTA for buying diesel-electric buses. It's not just buying a natural gas bus. It's converting your maintenance facility at a very high cost to make it safe to maintain those buses. So a one-time infusion of money, if it came to transportation, may be better served for those type uses where we could actually reduce the long-term recurring costs and need for additional dollars for that subsidy for transit. We'll see where that goes, but the two wagons are not hitched together, and the governor has never indicated to me that he intends to hitch them together. Although, because of the response he gets when he asks the question, he is suggesting that if the state stores are sold and privatized, some of those proceeds, at a minimum, should go to where people want them to go, which, based on his research, says transportation. So the other issue is the actual recurring revenue for transportation. And, I was in a meeting last week with the budget discussions. Obviously, the budget address is coming up from the governor about finding a way to introduce the transportation policy, transportation objectives on funding with the budget address, in or around the budget address. Where that occurs, I'm not quite sure yet. But they are also working on an overall jobs package, which would include both training, investment, and other things. Obviously, any type of investment in transportation creates jobs. Your industry, everybody who works in this industry would benefit from that, from job creation, as well as people not even in our industry. We all know the multiplier effect of what happens with manufacturing jobs and even the retail jobs where your people are out on site, staying at hotels, restaurants, things like that. So there's a multiplier effect of job creation with this investment. So whether you see the transportation initiative announced with the jobs package separate from the budget, with the budget, I'm not quite sure how that's going to flow yet. But those are the kind of discussions we're having right now. The elements of it have not changed a lot of what I told you about at APC. Again, my focus has been from day one is as much as I'd like to see us get everything that the Funding Commission recommended in today's political environment and today's economic climate, I think that's unlikely. So the reality is, what should we focus on? I think it's elements that make the long-term health of this industry something we can rely upon. Things like uncapping the oil company franchise tax to make it inflationary, rolling the flat tax into the oil company franchise tax to make that inflationary. Historically, you're lucky if you get action at the state level once every decade. If we're going to get action this time, let's make sure the thing we get action on are going to be inflationary so we don't see an immediate erosion of the items that we do get going forward. So the elements I've talked about in the past, the elements I'm still focused on. The other one that's a little bit emerging, I will say, is, again, Bob's probably here. I'm not sure who else was, if there are any other members that were on the Funding Commission here today. We talked about local enabling legislation in the Funding Commission report. It sort of evolved into a $10 surcharge on registration fees for local roads because they need money as well. But I think the important thing is on the local enabling legislation is to get it in place. And the reason is that the state has never, nor has the federal government, historically solved the finance problem. There's never been enough money. Whatever they go after, they end up with something less. Half of what they suggested the need is, a third, two-thirds, it's never enough. And right now, we don't have enabling legislation to let regions go above and beyond what the state's willing to do. Either counties or multi-counties go together and say, the state didn't solve it, we'd like to solve it. It's kind of funny because both the governor and I have been critical of the federal government, Congress, not allowing tolling and more widespread use of tolling. And we both said publicly that if you're not going to solve the problem, at least open the toolbox and allow the states to solve it. And yet, here we are at the state government, and I don't want to do the same thing to local government. I don't want to say, we're not willing to solve it, we're not going to let you solve it either. So I think it's important that we enact enabling legislation so local governments, counties, or multiple counties can go together and say, in Philadelphia, we're willing to charge our folks a little more to solve some problems that we think are important to the Philadelphia region. And we don't want to wait for the whole state to get together and vote for it. Same could happen in Pittsburgh, or if you look at the big CSBT project in the central part of the state. If there's a certain amount of funding available and not enough, and the regions want to go further, I think we should put the tools in the toolbox and let them do so. So I think that's an important part of moving forward on legislation. We'll see where this all goes, but hopefully what we'll see is an introduction of the governor's plan, and then, of course, the sausage-making of legislation occurs. And from that point, the House, the Senate will get involved. You all will get involved. Every other industry will get involved in lobbying for what they believe is best, and we'll see what comes out of it. But I'm just looking forward to the dialogue and debate. I'm getting a little tired of coming up and saying nothing's changed. I'd like to be able to stand in front of you and say, here's where we are today, and here's what it looks like, and here's how we're going to spend the money. Because we all know, in the end, the concrete that your predecessors put down 40 years ago, 50 years ago, is worn out. It's time to replace it. And we need to get at that, and it's something that's not going to get cheaper if we go forward. And what I've challenged everybody when I've got these groups together is that right now, all of you sitting in this room, collectively, we are the leadership of the industry. And I say we because it's not PennDOT, it's not me, it's all of you. You're the leaders of your company. You're the leaders of the individual firms represented here. Collectively, it's our turn to work on a legacy for the next group of people that come here. And collectively, we need to have success on this, because if we don't, it doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help our companies. It doesn't help our successors down the line. And more importantly, it doesn't help our children, because ultimately this just gets passed on. I just read today about in the Harrisburg paper about the federal deficit, and they said every baby born has a $50,000 noose around their neck as their share of the federal deficit, and it's growing every year. I have two twins that are 7 months old. It made my stomach turn thinking of what they're faced with if we don't solve that problem on the federal side. Well, in our little corner of the world, there's another deficit hanging out there. It's a deficit of underspending on transportation, on infrastructure, that isn't going to get cheaper. The materials are not going to magically get stronger as they age, any more than our bodies get stronger as we age. And we can't wave a wand and make that happen. So it's time for our turn, this group of us as leaders, to go out and work with the legislature, work with the public, and message us in a way that we achieve success, not just for our successors in this industry, but for our children, so that they're not faced with that same burden, an increasing burden on transportation investment. I'm going to continue to be an advocate for this, continue to work on it with the governor's office, continue to work on it with the legislature, the media, any opportunity I have. I know, because I know many of you, that you're going to continue to support us in this for all modes of transportation investment, and I mean it's important, all modes, not just highways and bridges. Mass transportation, rail, ports, aviation, they're all important to the overall economy in Pennsylvania, all important as they relate to one another in transportation modes and moving people and goods. It's an important topic. It's one that I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here before you today and talk about. It's one that I appreciate your support, both personally, professionally, and for the industry. And it's one that I hope that if you invite me back next year, we'll be celebrating success on it rather than talking about still trying to get it done. So that's kind of where we are as of 9:55 now, or 10:05 this morning, of what I know about what we're doing and what's happening in transportation finance. Again, I appreciate you having me, and I'd be happy to take any questions you have in the time we have remaining. Not a single question. It's just hard to believe. You may be the first group. Maybe it's because I don't have anything new to say. Bob, there you are. I knew you were here. Yeah, the politics of this are kind of interesting. It's like the politics of any season. I mean, you'd think when's the best time to do it? It's probably immediately after everybody's elected, because I think that's the only time you're not in election season these days. I was at a House Democratic Policy Committee meeting the other day in Pittsburgh, and they were talking about exactly that it's an election year. And I said, I'll ask you guys, when do you feel like you're not running? A 2-year House term has turned into a continual run for office. They no sooner get elected than somebody's announcing they're competing with them. And I think to some extent, 10 years ago, the election year was more of a factor than it is today. It's still a factor, though. The other interesting dynamic is that if you look at the House, on the Republican side, there are Republicans members who are more concerned about a Tea Party challenge in a primary than they are with the general election. They don't believe they're going to lose to a Democrat necessarily in the general election, but they're concerned if they put up a vote for a tax increase, and that's what this would be, frankly, no matter what we call it, user fees or anything else, in the eyes of the press and somebody running against someone, they'd say they voted for a tax increase. It's a very real phenomenon right now, is the Tea Party right side, far right side of the Republican Party challenging themselves and saying, if you vote for it, you're not a Republican, therefore I'm going to challenge you with a Tea Party challenge. And that season, the petitions end soon, the primaries are in April, so we've got kind of an election within an election season, which is the primary season. Then when you get close to the general session, general election in the fall, again, depending on whether this occurs during a budget process or it occurs towards the end of the session, there are those who believe maybe it's better to do this right before the election when people vote before they go home, and it's too late for anyone to take aim on it and make much out of it in terms of an election issue. Others believe we should do it after the primary and before the budget. Some believe we should do it with the budget. We'll see where that all falls out, but there's, as Bob said, being an election, there's no shortage of opinions about the political ramifications of a decision one way or another. So, yes, we've had a lot of dialogue about it. I don't know if there's any agreement on when the best or least risky time is. Most would say last year, but then last year they'd have said this isn't a good time. So, that's the issue of politics. I'm just an engineer, trying to learn more about politics, but when it comes right down to it, I'm glad I'm an engineer. You will never see me running for elected office, that's for sure.
I've read a lot about public-private partnerships and read about a lot of them across the country. And more recently, I was under the understanding that in Pennsylvania, we didn't have legislation to allow these kinds of things. And I just want to know the new administration and your view on the potential of doing public-private partnerships with firms.
Well, you're correct in the fact that we don't have legislation right now. Rick Geist has a bill in the House, and John Rafferty has one in the Senate. They've not been able to get the one in the House to the floor for a vote. And I hope they solve it. I mean, I hope they're able to get the administration and I are supportive of P3, but I want to qualify that by saying I'm supportive of it because it puts another tool in the toolbox. Do I think it solves our financial problem? Absolutely not. P3s are really a method of finance. It's saying, I don't want to borrow the money, you borrow it, or you provide it, but it still has to get paid back. One of the fallacies that happened, when the P3 stuff first got on the table is people were saying this is a solution to funding problems. It's not. It's a finance solution. Now, does it offer some interesting opportunities? Absolutely. I think on the smaller scale side, there could be some funding relief, meaning like right now we operate our 511 motorist network where you can call and get information about what's happening out there in the roads. And a lot of states privatize that, and then the private operators sell advertising. That's how it's getting paid for. Now, that's a small amount of money. We might spend $5 million a year on that, but we wouldn't have to spend that. Same thing with the advertising, like the service patrols, where we have in the Capitol Beltway, where we have tow trucks out. Those are PennDOT trucks. We pay for it. It comes out of our budget. The Turnpike, who has the ability to use public-private partnerships, uses an insurance company, and they advertise. So they don't have to pay for that. That's another way you could save money and reduce your costs. So I think there's some interesting things that could happen on the technology side, especially the 511 network. Frankly, the private sector is better geared to do that than we are, not because we can't do it, or we don't have the skilled people to do it. Doug Tomlinson and his crew are great at this, but because we're government, when we want to write a new application and say we want to provide an application on your smartphone or how you can download the 511, we have to write an RFP, and it has to be applicable to everybody who wants to apply for it, and generic, and we have to make sure it's open and fair. The private sector would just get some kid in T-shirts and jeans to write an app and put it on the phone before we could ever think about it. And so I think there's certain things it's better to do in the private sector. On the bigger scale, the type of projects you read about, like in Washington, D.C. and the Beltway, I think in our bigger markets there's an opportunity for that. They won't be solely funded by the private sector. There's not enough revenue. There'll still be a public sector share. Right now, if somebody came to us with a tremendous P3 proposal to do something on the Schuylkill Expressway to relieve congestion and said, we'll put in $2 billion, you only need to put $500 million in. I don't have $500 million. So, the P3 bill needs to be accompanied by a revenue package. Otherwise, it limits our ability to participate with these firms. So I hope it goes through. I think, as I've said many times, another provider of transportation isn't necessarily a bad thing. It creates a little competition. It brings some innovation. It keeps us and the Turnpike on our toes. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And as I said, there's some fringe things that I think will benefit. So I hope it does get passed. We are working with both of the chairs to try to get it to move through. It's been stalled for years. I hope this is the year it breaks. Well, we've been assuming level funding at the federal funding side for a while because, they're a couple years late with their last bill, and the best we could assume was level. Now, we're dropping our funding. The money we're sending out the MPOs and RPOs now, the projections we're showing are going down because of our state funding situation. Our accelerated bridge program, the bond bills for that are over. So for the last several years, we spent $200 million a year additional on bridges. That's going to go away. And now we have the debt service on that, which, of course, is going to eat away at funds that we would have available in the state. In addition, my predecessor, Al, I think rightfully canceled a lot of big capacity adding projects because we weren't going to get to them. The money that we reassigned from those, that we relieved from the engineering costs, if you will, we reprogrammed those into additional projects at a few $100 million a year last year. And that money's now spent, so there's nothing to replace that. On the federal side, we're looking at it and assuming level federal funding. That might be optimistic, but that's what we're assuming right now, looking forward. And I'm not optimistic they're going to do anything other than a continuing resolution in March. They talk about a 2-year extension at the same funding levels, but that's coming out of the House, the Senate, and the Senate, they can't get together on how they pay for it. So it's more likely that they'll just do a continuing resolution. Actually, I think it would be better for all of us. They did a continuing resolution through the next presidential election. Maybe, Bob asked about an election year, maybe, just maybe, the federal government, the Congress would actually govern and come up with a long-range transportation plan right after a presidential election when the next midterm election isn't for another 2 years. So optimistically for all of us, I think that might be the best thing that could happen. And I'm also, my colleagues at other secretaries of DOT across the country are doing the same thing I'm doing, and that's lobbying every one of our congressional delegation that comes to see us or we go to see them for increased flexibility in tolling. There are limited tools in the toolbox, and when you look at the CAFE standards, the fuel efficiency, you all can think about what car you're driving today and what you were driving 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Whatever you're driving's got higher fuel mileage, even if you're driving the same model. So we're getting less revenue per vehicle than we got 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. You go into the future, it's just going to continue down that path. We have to get some mileage-based tool, and that's what tolling is. So I'm hopeful that the next federal bill, if they do an extension, that maybe after the next election they'll get serious about not just talking about infrastructure banks and public-private partnerships and finance tools, but really talk about revenue-generating tools, which either federal gas tax and or tolling. But right now, we're assuming level federal funding for all modes going forward. The one thing that we are a little bit concerned about, which may not be a concern to many of you, is that the Amtrak funding subsidy for the Keystone East, that could go up as much as $20 million a year for us because of a reduction in federal funding. If that goes up $20 million, that's $20 million we've got to take out of something else. So there's not a lot of really good news right now on the federal side. I certainly hope that improves, but I think the best thing we could wish for is that they just stay level.
Do you think there's any hope of a vehicle miles traveled tax in the next decade?
We're going to, whatever the dust settles and whatever happens financially here in the state, we're going to then undertake a study for VMT and actually just look at the next generation of transportation finance. We're going to call it, I initially said we're going to call it a vehicle miles travel study for the Commonwealth, but I think we're going to call it the next generation of transportation finance and see what happens at the federal level with the law so we can look at scenarios of like, what if we went to tolling? I think if you could use tolling of the interstates and we could systematically say we're going to toll all the interstates so that we're not pitting one region against the other like the I-80 situation, which I was right in the middle of. I think if we could do that, that would take, 1,400 miles of our system and say we're going to do that with tolling, which is mileage-based. I don't think a true VMT with either an odometer tax or the chip in your car or whatever you want to call it, the GPS system, I think that's a 2030 type solution because we need something on a national level with that. And if you talk about the chip in the car, the privacy issues, people just are really opposed to that. I think if you told the younger generation that's on Facebook and whatever else they get on that, hey, we're going to have information out there about you, I think they could care less. But you talk about people our age or 40, 50, 60, there's no way they want to be tracked. And they would see it that way. So an odometer tax, even if you did it with an odometer tax where you said estimate your mileage and make payments every month to us and rectify it when you get your car inspected, even that, what do you do with out-of-state people? How do you charge them when they're driving through the state? So there's some issues that have to get worked out on the federal side on that. My own feeling is the best way to bridge the gap is to do more tolling. It's mileage-based. But it has to be widespread. Anytime you try to pick one road and say, let's toll this one, the people on that one say, why us? And it's a legitimate question. But if you said we're going to toll all the interstates systematically in the state, I think that takes that fairness issue and spreads it around the state and says everybody's going to be paying for the rebuilding of the interstate. So, but a true VMT, I really think that's a 2030 type solution. So the 422 tolling is a dead issue. The DVRPC has dropped it. And again, I think the issue there is the residents and the elected officials along 422 said, why us? Why not? Why did 309 get state money? Why did these other routes get state money and we have to use tolling to get ours? And frankly, again, I think if you said we're doing a more wider spread use of tolling, that would be different. But I was a project manager when I was in the private sector working for the I-80 thing. I was born in Du Bois, Pennsylvania, so I'm from that part of the corridor. Even your own family will turn on you. I called my one aunt and said, we got a public meeting in Du Bois. Is it okay if I spend the night? And she said, well, if you park in the back and nobody sees you, I guess it's okay. So even your own family will turn on you and talk about tolling one road. So I think we have to look at a widespread tolling. And then even on the 422 issue, I think that if you looked at a regional system down in the 5-county region of DVRPC in Philadelphia and said, even with the new funding, if we get a funding package, there isn't enough money to do everything we want to do on 422, 202, 322. You can list the projects and say we're $1 billion short for all these projects. If we did a $20 surcharge on registrations for 10 years, we could pay for all that. That would be how you do a local enabling legislation and make it regional and a regional benefit rather than one group paying for something the state couldn't afford to do. I'm not opposed to tolling. I just think the reality, as a matter of fact, you can probably tell I'm in favor of it, the reality of trying to select one and say, let's use the tolls to fix this one while we're not doing it on other roads, it just becomes difficult, unless it's a totally new road. Other states have had success in building new roads and new capacity of tolling. You try to toll an existing one. I know that would have added capacity, but you saw the result. A lot of political opposition, a lot of public opposition. So right now, that whole project is just dead. Bob, you got the ball rolling. Why don't you ask a question? That's right.